Try to recall from a previous chapter the organization of the nervous system, which can be classified in different ways. But remember that we have information that is going into the central nervous system. And there's two types of information that can go into the central nervous system. There's visceral information from your squishy guts, and then there's somatic sensory information from tissues such like skin or bone or muscle. As far as output goes, we have way more options. Motor output can go to either somatic tissues like your skeletal muscle or visceral tissues like all of your smooth muscle. Now, if it goes to visceral tissues, there are actually two more divisions. There's this division called the sympathetic, which we also call the fight or flight. And then there's another division that visceral information controls, which is called the parasympathetic, which is also known as the rest or digest. And these two, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, they're constantly fighting, or I guess it's more accurate that they're opposing each other, which is much similar to the way my brother and I acted for all of my childhood. You need to start looking at pictures of the brain. It's essential that you're able to recognize the different types of sections created by frontal, transverse, and sagittal sections that you see here. Most students are pretty good at picking out a sagittal section that cuts the brain into a right and a left portion, and that's this right here. This will be the most common section that we use. However, in the lab, we will use frontal and transverse pictures, which students tend to get mixed up with each other. They're a little bit more difficult to discern. So before we're done with the brain, you will have a feel for the anatomy produced by these types of sections. Just a warning, usually the ventricles or the open spaces and the choroid plexuses, which you can see the choroid plexuses here, they're blood networks, and you can see the ventricles here and here. Those are open spaces. And usually those things students can use as landmarks to help orient them in sections. So take a look at your, at the section on the left and the middle. Try to find open spaces and choroid plexuses or ventricles. When we talk about the brain, we have specialized terminology. Yep. We've been using ventral and dorsal when referring to the spinal cord, but here on the brain, we start to use rostral, meaning nose, and caudal, meaning tail. I don't know why I'm introducing this. Our book doesn't use these terms at all. I've never taught from a book that uses rostral and caudal, but anyway, you're going to know it. But look at how this complicates the application of dorsal and ventral. The dorsal surface of the brain becomes the superior surface, and the ventral surface of the brain becomes the inferior surface. I want you to think of a four-legged animal, because that is where these terms come from studying animals that are four-legged, not bipedal. The other thing that you should notice is that frontal sections of the brain are usually called coronal sections. And this is because a frontal section of the brain is cut along the same axis as the coronal suture. We're going to define and then describe 6 main areas of the brain. The cerebrum is the big brain hat. All of these structures here. We're going to cover the cerebrum last, because once you've been thoroughly exhausted by the rest of the brain, then we're going to cover that. The cerebellum is the little brain, which is caudal and ventral on the brain, or at the back and below the cerebrum. Sometimes when I get tired in class, I will mix the two words cerebrum and cerebellum up. So if you're studying when you're tired, just be sure that you're not doing that. The diencephalon is this internal area here that contains some pretty important components that we cover this semester lightly, but we cover in much more detail next semester. And then the last of the three major brain areas are actually contained here, which was once called the brainstem, and it is still called the brainstem. Science it's obviously progressed somewhat beyond just calling it the brainstem. And now we treat these three areas as distinct areas of the brainstem. We have the midbrain, which is just this like diffuse area up here. We have the pons, which is like this big zit growing off of the brainstem. And then we have the medulla oblongata, which actually has an oval-like appearance coming off the sides of the brainstem. So that's their sequence: dorsal to ventral, top to bottom, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata.